America, country or colony? Is the country known as America a free country? Are there allegiances to European countries currently? If you do a historical background on the United States of America, you could conceivably build a case for America still being under the control of foreign entities. Would you believe England being the major country that claims, by some, and still has, according to some, control over America by legal rights? First, let us define the term colony. Colony. For other uses, see colony disambiguation. In politics and in history, a colony is a territory under the immediate political control of a geographically distant state or city in ancient times. Some colonies were historically separate colonies or countries, while others were territories without definite statehood at the moment of colonization. The metropolitan state is a state that owns a colony. In ancient Greece, the city that owned a colony was called the metropolis within its political organization. Mother country is a term used to refer to the metropolitan state by its citizens that live in a colony. Today, the term overseas territory or dependent territory are preferred. See also the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories. People who migrated to settle permanently in colonies controlled by their country of origin were called colonists or settlers. A colony differs from a puppet state or satellite state in that a colony has no independent international representation, and the top-level administration of a colony is under the direct control of the metropolitan state. The term informal colony is used by some historians to describe a country which is under the de facto control of another state, although this description is awful contentious. In the modern usage, colony is generally distinguished from overseas possession. In the former case, the local population, or at least a part of it, not coming from the metropolitan controlling country, does not enjoy full citizenship rights. The political process is generally restricted, especially including question of the independence. In this case, there are some settlers from a dominating foreign country or countries, and often the property of indigenous peoples is seized to provide the settlers with land. Foreign mores, religions, and or legal systems are imposed. In some cases, the local population is held for unfree labor, is submitted to brutal force, or even to policies of genocide. By contrast, in the case of overseas possessions, citizens are formally equal regardless of origin, and it is possible for legal independence movements to form, should they gain a majority in the overseas population. The question of independence may be brought, for instance, to referendum. However, in some cases, settlers have come to outnumber indigenous people in overseas possessions, and it is possible for colonies to become overseas possessions against the wishes of indigenous peoples. This often results in ongoing and long-lasting independent struggles by the descendants of the original inhabitants. Colony may also be used for countries that, while independent or considering themselves independent of a former colonizing power, still have a political and social structure where the rulers are a minority originating from the colonizing power, such is the case with Rhodesia after the unilateral Declaration of Independence. The informal colony also has been used in relation to countries which, while they have never been conquered by force or officially ruled by a foreign power, have a clearly subordinate social or economical relationship to that power. The history of colonization and imperialization in 1945, originally, as with the ancient Hellenic Greek apoikia, The term colonization referred to the foundation of a new city or settlement, more often than not with non-violent means, but for instance the Athenian recolonization of Milos after wiping out the earlier settlement. The term colony is derived from the Latin colonia, which indicated a place meant for agricultural activities. These Roman colonies and others like them were in fact usually either conquered so as to be inhabited by these workers or else established as a cheap way of securing conquest made for other reasons. The name of the German city Cologne also derives from colonia. In the modern era, communities founded by colonists or settlers became known as settler colonies. The age of imperialization began in the 15th century with the initiation of the vast Portuguese Empire and also the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and lasted until the mid-20th century with the dismantling of the British Empire. During these centuries, European states, the United States, and others took a political control of much of the world's population and land mass. The term colony came to mean an overseas district with a majority indigenous population administered by a distant colonial government. Exceptions occurred: Russian colonies in Central Asia and Siberia, American settlements in the American West, and German colonies in Eastern Europe were not overseas. British colonies or overseas territories like the Falkland Islands and the Tristan da Cunha lacked a native population. Most non-European countries were colonies of Europe at one time or another, or were handled in a quasi-colonial manner. The European colonies and former colonies in America made extensive use of slave labor, initially using the native population, then through the importation of slaves from black Africa. The Spanish colonial empire once encompassed all of South and Central America, except for Brazil, with few exceptions. It crumbled starting in the early 19th century, after the Spanish and the Portuguese, the Dutch East India Company, VOC 1602, and later the Dutch West India Company, WIC, took over a lot of Portuguese possessions and expanded their large trade empire. You have to look up the Dutch colonial empires, informational to see that. In the 19th century, the largest European colonial empire was the British Empire under Queen Victoria, including India. France once held much of Western and Central Africa, along with Indochina. There existed various statuses and modes of operation for foreign countries. Direct control by the colonizing country became the most obvious. Some colonies were operated through corporations: the British East India Company for India, the Congo Free State under the very brutal rule of Leopold II of Belgium, were run as protectorates. Quasi-colonies were run through proxy or puppet governments, usually kingdoms or dictatorships. For instance, it may be argued that Cuba, before the revolution, was a quasi-colony of the United States, with an enormous influence of U.S. economic and political interests. Look up Banana Republic for more information. The United Kingdom used Australia as a penal colony. British convicts would be sent to forced labor there, with the added benefit that the freed convicts would settle in the colony and thus augment the European population there. Similarly, France once deported prostitutes and various undesirables to populate its colonies in North America. Until the 20th century, it operated a penitentiary on Devil's Island in French Guiana. The independence of these colonies began with that of 13 colonies of Britain that formed the United States, finalizing in 1783 with the conclusion of a war began in 1776 and has continued until about the present time, with, for example, Algeria and East Timor being relinquished by European powers only in 1962 and 1975 respectively, although the latter was forcibly made an Indonesian possession instead of becoming fully independent. This process is called decolonization, though the use of a single term obscures an important distinction between the process of the settler population breaking its links with a mother country while maintaining local political supremacy and that of the indigenous population reasserting themselves, possibly through the expulsion of the settler population. The movement toward decolonization was not uniform, with more newer powers, sometimes themselves ex-colonies or once threatened by colonial power, trying to carve a colonial empire. The United States, itself a former colony, expanded westward by waging brutal wars against the Native American population, including whole massacres of civilians, so as to make it possible for settlers to colonize the American West. It also colonized Hawaii and waged various wars and conduct armed expeditions and so as to assert power over local governments in Japan with the Commodore Perry and in Cuba, for example. European countries under the United States, exploiting the weakness of China, waning imperial regime, also maintained so-called international concessions in that country, a sort of colonial enclave. The coastal towns of Macau and Hong Kong were held on long-term leases by Portugal and the United Kingdom. During the first half of the 20th century, until its defeat in the Second World War, Japan, once afraid of becoming a European or American colony, built itself a colonial empire in China, Korea, and the Western Pacific, using brutal military force. Under the Geneva Convention of 1949, it is a war crime to transfer, directly or indirectly, the civilian population of a country power onto land that is under some country's military occupation. The reasoning for this crime is apparently to emphasize that it is now a violation of international law to annex territory through military force. This phase describes many of the acts of colonization in the past and arguably outlaws colonization. The Latin term or name Colonia also became the name of several towns, most famous of which we have aforementioned is in Cologne, Germany. Colonies in ancient civilization were as follows. Assyria was originally a colony of Babylonia. Carthage was a Phoenician colony. Cyrene was a colony of the Greeks of Thera. Naples formed as a Greek colony, and also see colonies in antiquity. Recent colonies, West Papua has become a colonial possession of Indonesia since 1969. India was a dominion of the British Empire until 1947. Rhodesia was formerly a colony in the British Empire until 1980. Korea was a colony of Japan. The Philippines were a colony of the United States until 1946. Today, none of the colonizing Europe and North American powers hold colonies in the traditional sense of the term. Some of their former colonies have been integrated as independent areas or have closer integration with the country. How did it all start? Was this already planned by the true intellect behind everything, Yahweh? America's forefathers saw opportunity when oppression arose because of religious belief conflicts. Perhaps a little history on this conflict would be in order. Until the latter part of the 16th century, the only Bibles available were printed in Latin. After the Reformation began, the Geneva Bible was published in English. For the first time, the common men or man were able to read the scriptures for themselves. The Geneva Bible is a version that would have been most familiar to the older generation of pilgrims. At the beginning of the 17th century, King James authorized another translation of the Bible into English, which still bears his name, KJV, King James Version. Until these English versions came into being, the common man was not able to read or understand the Scriptures. It was necessary for the ministers and church officials to tell the worshipers what was in the Bible and to interpret the Scriptures for them. As the English translations became more readily available, the people were able to read the Scriptures for themselves, and controversies began to arise concerning the interpretation of many passages in the Bible. Other controversies arose concerning the rituals of the church service, and this is taken from a historical study guide by Dwayne A. Klein. When the Bible was more made available to the common man and his family, the influence by the church and ultimately state was broken. Man was no longer subject to the interpretations of ministers favorable to the state. They could now read and understand what the Bible really said. This freedom gave way to new ideas. They saw the freedoms described in the Bible. They could read the Exodus story for themselves. They could see a way of escape from the tyrannical rule of their oppressive dictatorial kings and queens. The new world offered hope. It offered opportunity. It offered freedom. The state church, at the time of the Pilgrim Fathers were living in England, there was only one church approved by the English rulers. Everyone was required to attend that church and only that church every week. If the English ruler were Protestant, all the people of the realm were required to follow the Protestant beliefs and attend those church services. If the ruler were Catholic, everyone in the kingdom was required to practice the Catholic faith and rituals. All religion in the kingdom was strictly dictated by the government. That is what we call state church. The reigning rule appointed the archbishop of his or her choice, and every church in the kingdom was under the direct orders of the ruler and the archbishop. There was no freedom to choose what a person believed or how he could worship. Anyone who objected to the beliefs of the state church or the forms of the church services could be arrested, questioned, and thrown into prison. If they refused to give up their personal beliefs, they could be tortured in an effort to make them agree with the church state. If they still refused to give up their convictions after torture, they could be executed. Many people were imprisoned, tortured, and put to death. Those who were executed for their religious beliefs died painful deaths. Many were hanged and quartered. Some were burned at the stake, while others were crushed to death under heavy weights. There were two major groups of believers who disagreed with the beliefs and practices of the Church of England. One group wanted to stay in the church, but hoped to change its forms of worship. This group was called Puritan, because they wanted to purify the church. The other group did not believe the state church could be changed. This group was called Separatists, because they wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. At the beginning of the 1600s, a group of separatists began to gather at Scrooby in the northeastern county of Nottingham. Scrooby was located on the main post road, which ran between Scotland and London. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, and James VI of Scotland was to become James I of England, he traveled the post road on his way to be crowned. James I was a Protestant, and the Separatists were hopeful that it would be more tolerant of differing religious beliefs. It was not long, however, before the Separatists learned that differing religious views would not be allowed under the new king. Since the goal of modern historians is to rewrite history and to make it more, shall we say, PC, politically correct, the true story is sometimes lost in the translation. In the aforementioned paragraphs, we read the account of the true tyrannical rule by church and state. If you did not attend church every week, you were in trouble. If you objected to the beliefs of the so-called church-state religion, you could be arrested, questioned, and even imprisoned. There was no freedom of choice then. If you held beliefs contrary to the state-controlled religion, you could be executed for those beliefs. From where we sit, Americans are no longer even aware of the previous generation's personal conflicts to make this country free from religious oppression. They take these freedoms for granted. Many Americans are spoiled, self-centered, and selfish individuals who would not even be willing to give up their MP3 or iPod players if called on to do so for national security reasons. Hypothetically speaking, of course. My point? They would not even be willing to sacrifice anything for America today. These narcissistic generations concerns itself with self. Are all Americans like this? No. There are still some who are willing to fight, yes, even die for freedom. They have the spark, no, the flame of freedom's passion burning in their veins. They are willing to travel to distant lands and fight an evil, aggressive enemy without any reservations whatsoever. While on the other hand, we are inundated with cowards who constantly consider surrender as the only viable option. Traitors. These traitors appear regularly in news columns, television talk shows, and guests on the mainstream medium programming schedules. They promote treason and weakness at every opportunity. In bygone days, they would have been executed for such actions. I'm calm now. Americans fail to realize the communist, socialist influence present in our country now. Their presence can be felt in the State Department. How? By this department's anti-Semitic stance against Israel for one reason. That's how. Their presence is noticeable in our educational institutions called colleges. How? By the college's itinerary enucleated as curriculum. That's how. Also, the current drive to remove every vestige of any religion from the public's conscience. Religion, according to the communist ideals, is considered to be an opiate to or for the people. The founding fathers wanted religious freedom. They wanted to be free from tyranny, so they fought for it and won. This ends part 1. More to come. This is MacGavin, and I'll be saying more about this next time. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.